Hi there, Ron from RJM Music here. This week's video, we're going to talk about tempo, tap tempo, and MIDI clock, and all that good stuff. So it's a kind of a lengthy topic, but let's see if we can cover it all. So the masterminds can control tempo on any of your effects devices that support it. That's typically delay or modulation effects that can have an adjustable tempo and can be controlled externally. There are three different ways that you can control a pedal or effect processor that has tempo capabilities. The first one being an analog tap input, and that is like certain Boss pedals, electro-harmonics, and I'm sure quite a few others have a 1/4-inch input that's designed to just plug in a standard momentary or latching foot switch, and you can use that as a remote tap switch for the pedal. We can control those with masterminds that have function switch outputs like the Mastermind PBC and LT. Pedals that are MIDI capable, some of them will accept CC messages as sort of a substitute for a tap button press, and that works very similarly to the analog version, but it's just kind of a digital equivalent where each button press is represented by a MIDI CC message. And the third way to go about it is MIDI clock, which is a little more advanced feature where the mastermind sends a continuous stream of MIDI data that represents the actual clock signal, and that one has its advantages and disadvantages, but a lot of the more advanced MIDI products will support MIDI clock. So on the Mastermind, there are two things you can do to specify tempo, two main things at least, and one of them is to create a tap tempo button that that actually lets you tap your tempo into the Mastermind, which is then relayed onto your devices. And then there's also the ability to just specify actual tempos with beats per minute, and those can be specified in presets and songs and even on buttons. And so it depends on your purpose. I mean, and you can use both of them together. You can have, for example, preset settings for your songs and presets, but you can go and tap it in if you need to change the tempo for some reason, and you can use either or both methods, just depending on whatever you need for your performances. So let's talk about MIDI clock first. It's in a way it's the most technologically advanced, but in a way it's also the most simple of the methods. And MIDI clock, as I had said earlier, is a continuous stream of tempo data, and it actually runs at 24 times the speed of the actual tempo that you're looking for. And this stream of data is sent out on the MIDI cable, and any device that wants to listen to it can. It's not sent on a channel like your other MIDI messages are, so there's only one system MIDI clock, and you can't have different clocks for different devices, at least not without doing some crazy stuff and having multiple controllers. The main reason you would want to do MIDI clock is that it's the best way to keep things in sync at all times, because the same signal is being sent out all the time, and all your devices are receiving the same signal. They're always going to stay in sync with each other. There's no possibility for them to drift apart. In the other methods, where you are just doing a few taps and then just letting them run, it's possible that the clocks could drift apart a little bit. This probably was more of an issue back some decades ago when this stuff was invented, with less high quality hardware, and you might have had more clock drift. It's probably less of an issue now. Another advantage, in addition to the synchronization of MIDI clocks, is that you can have faster changes. Because MIDI clock runs so much faster than you would actually tap in a tempo, the devices typically will update more quickly when you change from one tempo to another. There are some downsides. Mainly it's just that when you have a MIDI clock set up, the one that's sending the clock is really kind of in charge, and typically you can't override it. So, sometimes I see people want to specify tempos in their, delay presets, for example, but once you have MIDI clock enabled and you start sending that clock, the pedal starts just listening to the MIDI clock, and it completely ignores the tempos that were set in the original presets. There's a little more flexibility with that in the other methods that I'll show you later. But as long as you don't mind your controller being, in charge, and you just want it to, override all the tempo control in all of your devices, then this is the method that you want. So let's set it up. So we've got our Mastermind editor here. We're working with the PVC6X today. And first thing we want to do is go over to the MIDI tab. And all we need to do here is set MIDI clock to transmit. On your pedal, you'll need to make sure that the pedal is set up to receive MIDI clock as well. And pretty much every pedal or effect processor I've seen that supports MIDI clock has a MIDI clock receive or MIDI clock enable setting in there that you can turn on or off. And so you want to make sure that any of those pedals that you want to respond to this have that turned on. And the funny thing is that's pretty darn easy, and that's all you really need to do. You can go in to your presets, and you'll see that in each preset there's a tempo specification. And here is where you can put in your tempo in beats per minute. The default for all these is just same, and it basically means just keep the last tempo that we specified. But you can certainly go in and say, this one's 60 BPM, and this preset is 72 BPM, and so on. And you can, each one of those will, the clock will just change as you change presets. Likewise, if you're using songs and set lists, you can specify them per song as well, and we can have 100 BPM here in this song. Now, if you're doing this and you're specifying per song, what's going to happen if let's say, for example, we have a song here and we have presets 1, 2, and 3 in here, what would happen is basically it'll use the song tempo unless there's a preset tempo specified. And so even though we've specified 100 here, preset 1 is set to preset 1 is set to 60, preset 2 is set to 72, and preset 3 is set to same, which so if we went and selected preset 1, preset 2, and then preset 3, we would go from 60 to 72, and we would stay at 72. So in this case, this tempo of 100 is actually ignored. So basically, if you don't need or want presets to control the tempo and you just want it per song, you can do a couple things. One of them is you can click here and get the additional options for tempo, and you can set it to song. And so now we would, get on preset 1, we would get 60, preset 2, we would get 72, and then preset 3, it would look at the song and use that as 100. So that's another option. And then there's another thing you can do here. A lot of people will just want tempos per song and not per preset. And so you can just check ignore preset tempos here in globals. And once you've done that, then basically whatever you specify here for tempos in the songs are just completely ignored, and it just only pays attention to the song name. So other options here I should show you. We've gone over same, which just keeps it the same tempo as it was before. We've gone over song, take the tempo from the current song, and then there's just off, which simply just shuts off the MIDI clock and tells and basically what happens after that, it depends on the effect device. It will suddenly stop receiving MIDI clock. And so what most pedals, what most effect processors will do is just keep going at the last tempo they received. There may be other behaviors in other devices, but that's what I've seen most of them do, is they're just going to keep running until they receive a different signal through MIDI clock. Songs also have different tempo specifications. They have off, same, and preset. So, basically you can tell it, for this song, I don't want any special tempo here. I just want to use the presets. And so that's just, another option for you. Okay, so that's songs and presets. There are a few other things you can do. You could, for example, set up a button to call up a specific preset. We'll take this bank button and we're going to change it to be instead an IA button. And in System Actions, there is a BPM action. And so you can have just a button change between two different presets, two different tempos. And so we could, for example, go from 60 BPM to 120. So when the button is off, we're at 60 BPM. When the button is on, it's 120. And you have other options available here as well. You can select the current preset's tempo. So you could, for example, like this one, for example, would switch to 120 when the button is on, and then it would just switch to whatever the current preset was, or whatever the current preset specifies for BPM when you turn the button off. Likewise, you can do that for song. Same, works as it does elsewhere, where we would do this, and now when you turn the button on, it switches to 120. When you turn the button off, it doesn't really do anything to the BPM. It just leaves it the same. And we additionally here we have add 1, -1, add 0.1, and -0.1. And so you can make fine-tuning adjustments. You can have sort of a tempo up, tempo down button that just bumps the tempo up or shifts it down a little bit. And some people like to be able to adjust it that way to make sure it matches whatever else is going on at the time. Okay, so that is MIDI clock. Well, actually, we need to set up a tap tempo button. So that's how you set up MIDI clock for specific presets, or for specifying exact BPMs per button. Now, if you want a tap tempo button, that's also easy, but it's completely different setup. So we're going to take this other external switch here, and that's a really good use for external switches, is to use them as a tap tempo button, but any button can do this. We're going to set this one to an IA button, and we're going to turn on flash with tempo. And this is kind of the key thing, because really it's more than this. It doesn't just flash with tempo. It also basically makes it a tempo button as far as the system is concerned. So the system will pay attention to taps on this button and will calculate tempo accordingly. So we click that, and this is not a well-documented feature, but we should also have update state on preset change turned on. And this is something I've been meaning to put some more stuff in here to clarify what's going on. But basically, this kind of means that we want not only the button to be a tempo button, but we want the Mastermind to be in charge of this button. There are other devices that kind of do remote tap tempo, like the Axe Effects, where you want it to do the tap tempo calculations, and in that case you would turn this off. But if most of the time you want this on, and this has made it now a tap tempo button. So we hit done, and once you've done that, you can tap it, and on the main screen, after a couple taps, it will show for a short while the current tempo BPM that it's calculated. And now, since we have MIDI clock set to master, this Mastermind will now start sending its tap tempo at that tempo, and it will continue to do that until we either select a new preset or run a BPM action or tap in a new tempo. Okay, so that is MIDI clock. And now, well, what if we have a more basic pedal that doesn't have MIDI support at all, and maybe just a tap tempo input? And so now this is where we have analog tap available. And this works with anything that has a function switch output. The Mastermind LT and the PVCs have one or more function switch outputs. The GT doesn't have function switch outputs built in, but you could connect something to it, such as a mini effect gizmo, or one of our older amp gizmos, or other third-party function switch MIDI devices that can control relays based on MIDI commands. And so a lot of the stuff is the same. What we would do for a tap tempo button is only slightly different. We would keep this as it is, and we just need to add something to trigger that function switch. And so we would go audio, function switch, and we'll call it function switch 1. And so now, basically, when we press this button, the function switch turns on, and we press it again, and the function switch turns off. And you have to play with it a bit. These settings will differ from device to device. Probably the first thing, if it isn't doing the right thing when you try this, the first thing you might want to try is turning on momentary, because a lot of these devices are expecting a momentary switch that turns on when you press it and turns off when you release it. But in any case, once you've set this up and sent your settings down to your device, when you tap it, you'll hear the function switch click, and so basically all you're really doing is making a remote tap switch for the device, and so presses on your Mastermind will trigger the jack on the device and tap it just like you were tapping on the device itself, assuming it has a tap tempo switch. So this is only marginally useful because your device might already have a tap tempo switch on it, but either you want the switch closer to you, or you could even control more than one device at a time. You can, for example, with let's say two Strymon pedals set up for tap tempo. This is one case that I have tested, and I've gone in great detail on this on the function switch video, but it's not always safe to split the function switch jack with a Y cable to two devices, or an insert cable, I should say, to two devices, but I've tested the smaller Strymon pedals and those seem fine. So let's say we have two of those pedals, and we can set up a second action to control function switch number 2 now. And so now this button is sending taps not only to one pedal, but both at the same time. And so this is where it gets a little more useful, where you can control 2 analog taps, or more if you have more function switches, and have them work simultaneously. So that's definitely an advantage here over just using standard tap switches. Okay, and so there is a feature that allows us to use the preset tempos as well. What we'll do is we'll turn off MIDI clock. You really don't want to use more than one of these tap tempo or BPM options at the same time. So we're going to turn off MIDI clock now, and we have a feature called auto tap. If you go to the globals section here, you have auto tap, and it asks for a number of taps and a macro number. Setting taps to 0 disables this feature. So we're going to turn this, typically you want it to send, well, it could be 4 taps. I would say somewhere between 3 and 6 taps is what most devices would expect, but you're going to have to experiment with it. And then we need a macro. And so we're going to leave this at macro 0. And all a macro is, this will be dealt with in another video, but all a macro is just a list of actions like you would have on a button or something, but it's a list that can be called from any other place. It's kind of just like a storage, I guess, for commands. So we're going to set up a macro, and we're going to call this tap tempo. And all we want to do is we're going to duplicate what we did on that button. We're going to go audio, function switch number 1, and we'll add that second one too, audio, function switch number 2. And so what's going to happen once we've done that, anytime the system changes tempo, like if we go from preset 1 to preset 2, it says, oh, now we're at 72 BPM. If auto tap is turned on here, what it's going to do is it's going to run macro number 0 here, and it's going to say, well, I need to turn on function switch 1 and function switch 2. And what it'll do is it'll actually, it will sort of automatically turn them on and off. So it's basically forcing those switches to turn on and off at a 72 beats per minute rate, and sort of, so basically, acting as an automatic tap tempo. And you'll hear it when you switch from one preset to another. You'll actually hear the click, 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 click as it's as the relays are triggering and sending the tempo to the to your devices. And so that is compatible with all the other BPM options I showed you in the MIDI clock part of this video. And so this works as well. It's it's not as fast as MIDI clock, but it has a lot more compatibility. Another advantage to this approach is because it's not a continuous tempo, but it's basically just giving it a few taps and saying, this is the tempo I want, then it no longer is overriding necessarily the whatever tempos are stored in the device. So if you've got your delay and you have certain tempos set in each preset, you can basically you can, for a preset, specify no tempo here, and you change presets on the pedal, and the pedal will use its own tempo because it hasn't received anything to contradict that from the Mastermind. Okay, and there's one third option as well, and that is using MIDI CCs. And so this is kind of a kind of equivalent to the analog tap, but instead of actually sort of sending an analog signal, it's sending a digital signal, a MIDI command. And so what we'll do is go here and we'll set up a Strymon timeline, as we so often do. And what we'll do here is go back to our macro, and instead of triggering a function switch, we're going to make it a CC toggle, and we're going to send it to the timeline, and we'll select the CC, and we will find tap tempo. Now, on some pedals, you'll see that there are two taps. There's like a tap button, and then there's a tap tempo. Generally speaking, when you see that, choose the one that isn't the tap button. In my experience, this tends to be a little more MIDI friendly. I'm not sure necessarily why they specify this one, because it seems like if there are two, this one generally works better. So we've now made it do that. We'll do the same here. And well, actually, I guess we need a second device. So we will put in our Mobius. So Strymon, Mobius. We'll assume this is on MIDI channel 2. Unlike MIDI clock, these MIDI CCs are sent per channel, and so we do need to have our devices on different channels, and we need to send on both channels if we want both pedals to receive these taps. So we'll now go to Mobius, and again we select tap tempo. So now every time we change presets, which causes a BPM change, it will send these MIDI messages to the devices, and basically they'll register it as a tap. And again, like the analog tap, this all will just kind of work with all your BPM specifications. You could switch from one method to another and not have to change your BPMs at all, and it'll just work. The only thing you need to do here is, adjust your tap button. And again, you would want to turn these, change these function switches to CCs to, make them use the new method. Or because we have a macros are reusable, and we could just remove both of these, add a new action, and go System, Macro, and the off macro. Actually, I guess we would want them both like this, 0 on and 0 off. So basically, instead of actually saying, I want to send a CC and I want to send another CC here, I can just say, just do what it says in the macro. And so the end result is the same. The nice thing is that we only have to do this once. We're using the same macro, the same list of commands for both the tap tempo button here and we're also using it for the auto tap here. And so that's kind of where macros become useful, is because if we ever need to make changes to these commands, we only have to do it in one place instead of two, or potentially more if we have multiple buttons that call this macro. So the advantages of this approach, there are a lot of devices that don't even have an analog input, so this is obviously, one of that already eliminates the ability to do analog tap on some devices. MIDI CCs, like I mentioned before, with the analog tap option, it's not a continuous stream of information. It's easier to override it in your pedals presets. So if you want some presets to have the tempo coming from the Mastermind, you can send the CCs and override the tempo. But in other presets, you can have it come from the just not have the Mastermind send anything at all to the pedal, and the pedal will just use its own built-in settings for the preset. And an advantage on MIDI CCs over MIDI clock also is that MIDI clock, because it's a continuous stream, can be noisy. If you don't have very well shielded MIDI cables, this continuous stream of MIDI data can be picked up with your other audio hardware, and you can hear like a little buzz or kind of a zipper noise or something, and that's just the MIDI data leaking out. A properly shielded system won't do this, but you'd be surprised at how many times people thought their systems were fine until they started using MIDI clock, and then they could hear the noise leaking out. Where MIDI CCs are only a couple of commands sent every time the tempo changes, and so it's a much quieter operation. So that is it for Tap Tempo. Any questions or anything, please feel to post below. And certainly, as always, let us know if you have any other topics you'd like us to address here. Like and subscribe as always. We'll keep these videos coming as we can. And thanks very much.